Good morning and welcome back, and welcome to day 2 of Meditation Australia's annual conference. And this year it's embodied meditation. For those who were able to be with us all day yesterday, we were sharing in the afternoon what an incredibly beautifully curated rhythm of the day. Such wisdoms and different kinds of windows and perspectives into this idea of here we are as embodied beings in this world, and how is it that meditation is really offering us kind of support on all levels in our lives. So it was a very rich day, and I'm sure those who haven't seen it will be jumping straight on to see the recordings, and those of us who were here review them, because they were rich and inspiring and extremely beautiful. Okay, so hope you're ready for another day, which is yet again rich and inspiring and beautiful. And we're going to begin this morning with one of Australia's treasures in this area of meditation, mindfulness, consciousness, and this blend and building bridges between the world of the mystic and the scientist. So let me introduce to you Craig Hassed. Professor Craig Hassed OAM has been working within the Faculty of Medicine at Monash University since 1989. He is coordinator of mindfulness programs across Monash and is the founding director of education at the Monash Centre for Consciousness and Contemplative Studies. His teaching, research, and clinical interests include mindfulness, mind-body medicine, lifestyle medicine, integrative medicine, and medical ethics. Craig developed and integrated into the Monash medical curriculum the world-first mindfulness-based healthy lifestyle course called the Health Enhancement Program, and has collaborated with Australian and international universities, helping them to integrate similar content. Yay. He has authored over 110 papers in peer-reviewed journals and has published 14 books and 17 book chapters. Craig was the founding president and is our patron at Meditation Australia, is a Smiling Mind ambassador and a regular media commentator. He co-authored with Richard Chambers 2 free mindfulness MOOCs, however you pronounce them, depending where you are in the world, massive online open courses, MOOC, in collaboration with Monash University and FutureLearn and Wait, both of which are rated by Class Central as the 2 leading online mindfulness courses, and among the top 10 online courses for any subject globally. Not surprisingly, in 2019, Craig was awarded the Medal of the Order of Australia, an OAM, for services to medicine. It's with great pleasure and privilege that we welcome this morning Craig Hassed. Thanks, Craig.
Thank you very much, Carolyn, for that very generous welcome, and it's great to be with everybody this morning, and so great to be connecting, I suppose, virtually, and we've gotten very used to that over the last few years, but exploring the important role that meditation, the contemplative part of life, which is really coming so much back to the fore recently, and for very good reason, I think, is an antidote in many ways to this modern distracted world that we live in. I'm going to be giving a bit of an overview of some of the science, the mind-body relationships, how mindfulness and other forms of meditation can affect the brain. And it's fantastic to see so much great research going on, not just at Monash University and Jakob Howie and all our team looking at consciousness science, but people all around the world have been doing this for many, many decades. So anyway, fasten your seatbelts. I'll get underway, and I will provide the slides at the end. Too, I'll need to be given opportunity to share my slides, so somebody can make me co-host. That would be great. And so I will provide a handout after the presentation today, so you don't need to worry too much about taking notes if you want to do that. So anyway, let's see I'll need to be given an opportunity to share my screen if somebody can do that in the background. That would be great. Otherwise, you're just going to be sitting here looking at me for the next 45 minutes, and we can just meditate together, perhaps. Good. I think I've got the opportunity now. Excellent. So let's dive in. So meditation as mind-body medicine was what I was invited to speak on today. I'll just start off with two laws of nature. I suppose there are lots of laws of nature, but I'll just mention two. The first one is one that I often cite, and it goes right back to the ancient Greeks, but I suppose put most succinctly by Marsilio Ficino, the Platonic philosopher in the Renaissance: the body is the shadow of the soul. And just a couple of words about that. It's a metaphor that's used in many of the world's great wisdom traditions. Soul being a translation of the word psyche. What goes on in the mind has powerful effects on the physical world, but of course the whole thing is driven by the source of light, that is awareness. What we give our attention to in the mind has profound effects on the body or the physical world. So if you want to create or make something, you give your attention to a creative thought or inspiration, and you physically go about bringing that into being, as it were. The same thing with the mind. When we give our attention to a happy thought or an angry thought, that very quickly translates into physiological effects, not just in the brain, but right throughout the whole body. So the body is the shadow of the soul, and in many ways we can't understand the mind-body medicine science unless we come back to this very, very ancient philosophical principle that you don't just find in the Platonic tradition, but all of the world's great wisdom traditions. The second one, Barry Commoner, an environmentalist ecologist in most noted from the 20th century. The first law of ecology is that everything is related to everything else. And our way of studying medicine and the body and so on for decades, for generations, has been to silo off different systems as if they're separate. But we understand, of course, that everything in our environment around us, and also everything in this microenvironment we call the body, is interacting with each other. You can't affect one thing without affecting everything else. So in many ways, these two laws of nature are really exemplified through lots of different examples of science in mind-body medicine. Just a little graph for you, just looking at the number of new publications on mindfulness published in peer-reviewed journals listed on PubMed each year. So up to the middle of this year, there was another 1,000 or nearly 1,800. So there's about 10 new peer-reviewed journal publications every day, just on mindfulness alone, let alone all the other forms of meditation as well. And you can see a massive growth there. So I won't go into it. I'm not going to even pretend to even scratch the surface of this research, but I'm going to pick out a few examples that I think perhaps might be interesting or useful to illustrate some key points. Now, the first thing I want to say is just a little bit about the stress response, or the fight or flight response. It gets a bad rap, it's bad for us, but look, activating the fight or flight response in certain situations can be pretty good. And when we activate it in these circumstances, it's not an anxiety response. Nature has not come in and coded us and put into our body an anxiety response. It's an activation response that in a situation like this can be activated appropriately. And if we're lucky, that might be the difference between life and death. That's the fin of a 4-metre shark, just in case you're wondering. It's not a dolphin fin. And Mick Fanning, this famous Australian surfer, of course, got out of this situation unscathed. But I'm not going to go into all of the details associated with the fight or flight response, but it's an adaptive response based on a present moment threat. And it's like, if to use a metaphor, it's like if you had a turbocharge button on the dashboard of your car, you press that button and the body goes into a completely different gear. The turbocharge buttons, if you like, are the amygdala, and that tells the body pump out adrenaline and cortisol and a whole bunch of things. There's this cascade of effects right throughout the brain, different levels, and telling the body to switch on. And it's a threat to self. Now, one of the things that's interesting about a threat to self, if we have an idea about ourselves that we're strongly attached to, of course, and that gets threatened, then we activate the same fight or flight response. It's whatever we identify ourselves with. And so if our ego is threatened, of course, then we activate the fight or flight when it's challenged in some kind of way. And we probably all know how painful that can feel. And of course, there's no shark in the room. It's just because our sense of self is being threatened at that time. Of course, if we drop our attachment to all those ideas about ourselves, we might find there's a lot less to get stressed about. But this fight or flight response is actually based on present moment situation, clearly perceived. The unfortunate thing is that we mostly activate the stress response, not based on a clearly perceived present moment threat, but based on imagination taken to be real. Like if you're awake at 3 in the morning and present moment reality is a soft mattress and a soft pillow and a warm doona and a quiet room, but in our mind, we're totally somewhere else, living a future that hasn't even happened or dredging up a past that's already come and gone. And if, when we're not conscious, when we're not aware, not paying attention properly in the present moment, it is easy to take that imaginary stressor to be real, and the body faithfully translates that into fight or flight. That is not a turbocharge of energy. We give it other names like anxiety. It's an inappropriate activation of an absolutely wonderful system. And about 99.9% of the time we do that, it's based on imagination taken to be real. Now, I have mentioned this in previous talks, but just to remind you or to let you know about it if you're new to this field, but the effect of this day in, day out produces a wear and tear on our system called allostatic load. Overactivating this stress or sympathetic nervous system day after day has a whole cascade of effects on the body, for example. So this sort of short-term burst in immunity you get while you're fighting a shark, because your immune system is on high alert, ready to fight off infections. But when we're activating this system day after day, we get this immune dysregulation. What that means is we get less defense against coughs, colds, and infections, but we get more inflammation. So what's adaptive in the short term with a clearly perceived threat is not adaptive at all. In fact, quite the opposite over the long term. It accelerates the hardening of the arteries called atherosclerosis. It leads on to heart attacks and strokes and so on. Metabolic syndrome. So, you know, when your doctor's checking your blood pressure, blood glucose, blood lipids, and these are important risk factors for cardiovascular disease, of course, and bone demineralization, which we also call osteoporosis because of the high cortisol levels day after day. But we also lose brain cells at a rapid rate. And 2 areas are particularly targeted by these stress chemicals: the hippocampus, which is the learning and memory centers of the brain, and the prefrontal cortex, working memory, executive function. These are higher. So this is like the leadership level of the brain, and we don't want it damaged in these kinds of ways. The area of the brain that becomes bigger and more reactive is the amygdala, and that's the turbocharge button. So it starts to fire off all the time in traffic, or, you know, just in a queue in the supermarket, etc. When it's got no reason to fire off, it starts firing off, and we literally wire the brain for more stress. Okay, now stress contagion. We talk a lot about infectious disease and how contagious that is, but stress is contagious as well. And we learn this from a pretty early age. This particular study, a study of mothers, and what they did is they had their mothers and the infants, and they took the infants out of the room for a short while. And the mothers in the room were either put into a situation where they were relaxed and calmed and so on, or into a situation where they had to do a stressful task. After that, they brought the children back in, or the infants back in, and they either sat the infant on the mother's lap or sat the infant in a high chair next to the mother. And they wanted to measure what was the impact on the children. And what they found is the infants of the mothers who had been in the relaxation situation, the infants had a relaxation response themselves when they were brought back into the room. The infants of the mothers assigned to the stress situation, they showed a stress response like their mothers when they were brought back in. But if the infant was put on the mother's lap, it was a much bigger stress response than if the infant was put in the high chair. So this sort of stress contagion, and we pick up patterns from very early in life. it would be interesting, of course, to see similar studies done for fathers. Would it be the same effect? Would it be more? Would it be less? Most of the research is, of course, done on women at the moment, but it would be interesting to see if there was a different effect with fathers. But nevertheless, stress contagion. And we all know this. You step into a room where somebody's very calm in a crisis, it feels very differently to when you step into a room and somebody's very stressed in a crisis. Now, anger. Let's take emotional states like anger. And this study was looking at how often a person got angry. Not very often, about once a month, kind of average, a couple of times a day, or a person who gets angry quite often, 5 times a day. And they looked at whether they had low or medium or high cardiac risk factors, like, you know, in all the risk factors you could measure, you know, their weight and blood pressure, etc. And what they wanted to see was what was the impact of anger and what was the kind of additive effect that had to the other risk factors. So when you look, there are excess cases of heart disease per 10,000 people per year. For the people who are getting angry very often, so, and especially if they had high cardiac risk factors, there were 657 excess cases per 10,000 people per year. That's a lot. So not only do the usual risk factors that doctors are looking out for increase the risk, but anger has an exponentially negative impact. And of course, we activate the fight or flight response when we get angry. Now, I'm not going to say, oh, anger is never appropriate and so on. It could be appropriate in a certain circumstance, but the great majority of anger we experience is not helpful. It's not necessary. It harms ourselves and it often harms others, of course. Now, what's interesting about this as well is what goes on unconsciously. So this was looking at inducing anger, even unconsciously, reprioritizes mental and physical resources towards action, that is, activates the fight or flight response, and also biases thinking. So what they did in this study was while recording the physiological reactions, the words anger or relax were presented subliminally. So the people didn't actually see the word, it was presented very quickly and we don't consciously register it. It was just like the word was presented so quickly the person couldn't actually consciously recognize it. So subliminal. And then just prior to doing a rapid decision-making task. Now what they found was the subliminal anger delayed their decision-making abilities compared to the relax prime. So if they primed with the word relax, they made those decisions better and more quickly than if they had the anger prime. And particularly for people with high trait anger, they didn't just activate the stress response, but it had the biggest effect on their performance. So just even a subliminal, something that, and people often say, I don't know where this stress comes from. I don't know where the anger comes from. But there are these things going on in the environment we're not even aware of normally, unless we're really paying attention to the kinds of things that are triggering these responses. Now, if we just ascribe, of course, this response to things going on around us all the time, we miss the point that we actually have a choice about how we relate to those things. We can actually learn to regulate this system for ourselves. Now, in this particular study, this study was looking at individuals who tended to activate a lot of cortisol, which is one of the primary stress mediators. So a lot of cortisol when they were put in a stressful situation. So they got this group and they put them into 2 groups. So what they were going to do was that they were going to, these were actually female teachers, and they were going to stress them on 3 different occasions. And but in 2 different groups. So one group, well, they were just going to get stressed one time, put through a stressful challenge, and then they're going to do that a few weeks later, and then a few months later. But the other group, they put them through the same stressor the first time, but they then took them through a program to help them to train attention, to be more present, and also to learn to just ride those emotional waves. So when emotionally uncomfortable things arose, they learned better how to just sort of work through, breathe through, move through those emotion reactions. So half the women got that training, the other half didn't. So 3 separate stress tests, baseline, post-training, and 5 months later. And so what they found was that the group who did not get this training, they had a big cortisol reaction the first time, but the second time, even a bigger cortisol reaction, and the third time, an even bigger one again, because what were they doing? Oh, it's coming up again. Oh no, this situation, it was so stressful last time, it'll be even worse this time. So the person was living that future event thousands of times. So they were primed when they went into it to be very stressed. But what they found was that the group who had this training, they did not keep increasing that stress response. In fact, there was a trend towards less and less stress. If you had a bigger group and you followed them for longer, you would find that there would be this reduction of the stress response over time. So these are reactions we can learn to be aware of, and we can learn to manage. One of the interesting studies, this came from Herbert Benson, who many of you would know, of course. He coined the term the relaxation response. This was one of the studies they did at the Harvard Mind Body Medicine Institute, and they found that the relaxation response, even when you practice it just one time, within minutes, the genes that regulate stress response are being dialed down. It's like turning down the volume on the stress genes. What they found, though, was that it very quickly went back to where it was before the person did the practice. So if a person practices it again and again and again over the long term, then it actually leads to more persistent and deeper down regulation of the genes that regulate the stress response. So this is not just, oh, my muscles feel a little bit more relaxed, or I'm a little bit less tension in the body. This is actually starting right down on the level of the DNA of the cells. You know, it's funny to think that when a person's sitting in a chair looking like they're doing nothing, that they're actually doing a little bit of epigenetic reprogramming, which is quite an interesting consideration. Now, my wife just stopped and said, "You weren't even listening, were you?" I thought, that's a pretty weird way to start a conversation. Now, as you can tell, maybe somebody wasn't paying particularly good attention a few moments ago. Now, many of you would know of the term default mode or default brain in the default mode network. Now, when we're attentive, present, in the moment, engaged, all right, so the task positive network is activated. We're focused on task. The executive functioning circuits are working well. We're processing information. So we're responding well to the environment, etc. When we're not present and engaged, and the research suggests probably at least 50% of the time we're not present and engaged, then we're in default mode. So somebody might be talking to us, but we're not listening to what they're saying because we're actually rehearsing in our own mind what we're going to say as soon as they stop talking. Or you're looking at the screen now, but you're not taking in what's being said because you're thinking, what am I going to have for lunch today? Or you're thinking about, where am I going to go for a holiday? Will I go overseas this year, or will I wait till next year when the airline industry is working well again? So this default mental activity, it's like the imagination circuits are active, but the executive functioning circuits are pretty much offline. And that's why it's so easy to take our imagination to be real. We've got a lot of different words for it, like away with the birds and, inattentive, distracted, but also rumination, worry, catastrophizing, negative self-talk. So there's a lot of default mental activity, surprise, surprise, in states of poor mental health, like stress, anxiety, and depression. Also, these default mode networks are not working particularly well in a whole range of other things as well. So, for example, if you're not paying attention, your memory circuits are offline. So we shouldn't be surprised day after day, week after week, year after year, if we're in that state, then it's associated with a higher risk of, say, Alzheimer's disease, which it is. So how do we function when we're so anxious and so worried about something, and the amygdala is firing off so much, and the executive functioning circuits of the brain are not working well? So if you've got a student who's very anxious and they step in, they can't process information well because the decision-making, information processing of the areas of the brain are overwhelmed by anxiety about, will I fail? Will I pass? What if I do? What if I don't? What I'm going to say to my parents if I don't do well, etc. And so it actually, our performance, if we're most stressed, drops when we need it the most. So we all know how that feels. Now, that's been known for quite a long time. And we would know, of course, for a much, much longer time, for thousands of years, we have known the remedy for distraction. That is to train our attention. And so the formal practice of meditation, now there are many different varieties of meditation, and people can categorize them differently, as often do, mantra, using senses or the breath, so focused, and that would be a focused form of mindfulness meditation, stillness meditation, focused attention versus open awareness. Some people define the open monitoring or open awareness forms of mindfulness as mindfulness, the focused attention differently, but there are many different ways of categorizing it. But the formal practice means sitting in a chair or on a cushion or a meditation stool, but doing nothing other than paying attention for, whether it's for 5 minutes or 10 or 20 or an hour, however long a person's sitting for. Now, just to emphasize, the reason we do that is to have a better chance of getting out, back into day-to-day life and being more present, being more aware, living more consciously, being aware of when we wander off into default mode and bring our attention back to listen to a partner who's speaking, driving, down the road and often a total daydream and, bring the attention back to the road. You've got a really full-on day at work, so much stuff to do. And you've got a lunch break and just coming back and just tasting your food, giving yourself a mental break rather than just sitting there eating the food on automatic pilot while we're ruminating about how many things we've got to do and have I got enough superannuation for early retirement yet because I can't stand my job and I can't stand my boss and et cetera, et cetera. So just coming back to tasting the food. So that's the informal practice. Now, in terms of what's understood about the neuroscience of this now, so with a focused attention practice, so coming back to the breath, for example, mind wanders off back to the breath or back to the body, as in a body scan, or any other focused point for the attention. So we go into default mode, often a daydream, and you know what, if you're sitting for half an hour practicing meditation, this will probably happen quite a number of times. You go into default mode, there's a whole lot of areas of the brain that start firing off. And then all of a sudden you become aware that you're distracted. So two particular areas, the anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insula, these two particular areas of the brain light up, and they seem to be very important for noticing that we're distracted. And then you reorientate your attention. So when you're practicing meditation, you come back to the breath, for example. Or if you're driving your car, you come back to the road. So two particular areas very important for that. And then there's one particular area very important for sustaining attention until we go off into a daydream again. The average human being's got an attention span of about 8 seconds these days. So you can imagine that this is happening many, many times if a person's sitting there for 5 or 10 or 20 minutes. So every time we notice and come back and reorientate our attention, that's like 1 rep for the attention circuits of the brain. It's not like terrible that this happens. It's like, well, it happens. But the important point is that we get better at just noticing, and with a minimum of fuss, just gently coming back to what we're doing, and then just staying with that until the mind wanders off. Oh, that's okay. Just notice, back on task. So that's 1 rep for the attention circuits in the brain. And if we do that regularly, then the brain changes. So the default mode network, this is Judson Brewer and his team in the States. And of course, a lot of default mental activity and depression, anxiety, etc. But when you're sitting down practicing meditation and you notice your attention comes back, it switches off the default circuits, right? So we go out of rumination and worry mode and back in the present moment. But what's interesting is that over time, when people are actually more experienced with this, then when the default circuits activate, then areas of the brain associated with self-monitoring and cognitive control switch on much more quickly. That means the person gets better at noticing, oh, away with the birds again. Cognitive control, oh, is that where I need my attention to be right now? No, just come back to what I'm doing. So you're under pressure at work, got a tight deadline, and your attention goes from what you're doing to worrying about, will I reach the deadline or won't I? What if I do? What if I don't? What's my boss going to say to me? Oh, all of a sudden you notice, oh, worry again. Okay, get better at noticing, bringing your attention back on task. Now, so this reduces the vulnerability to default thinking, but of course, better attention on task means that we actually cope and function better as well. Now, another term for this kind of thinking is self-referential thinking. And so this is a particular review paper that reviewed many studies. And self-referential thinking is a key mechanism through which mindfulness is therapeutic for people with internalizing disorders, so things like depression and anxiety. So because all this sort of me thinking, oh, what's wrong with me? What's everybody think about me, etc. This kind of self-referential thinking, and we all know what it feels like. So in terms of how what the research has shown about this, so this is looking at all the neuroscientific studies on this kind of self-referential thinking and its role in internalizing disorders, 4 key findings. So in these disorders, a lot of self-referential thinking and emotion dysregulation. Mindfulness reduces these internalizing symptoms, right? So the ability to be aware and just gently unhook from that kind of thinking, re-engage with the moment, with our life. It promotes a shift from narrative self-focus. So all this me thinking, you know, I remember people say, oh, mindfulness and so on. Well, really any form of meditation, oh, you're just focusing on yourself. You're so self-obsessed, practicing all that stuff. It's actually the opposite of that. It's a complete misunderstanding. It's stopping thinking about ourselves. That's the aim. Because this self-referential thinking is feeding all sorts of thoughts we have about ourselves and everybody else and what they think of us, and they might not think that at all, but we've got this story running in our head, and for us that becomes our reality. We put words into people's mouths, we make assumptions about what they think, etc., and then that becomes our reality. It might have nothing to do with reality. So mindfulness shifts the focus from that and helps a person to come back to more present-centered awareness. And mindfulness induces changes accompanied by reduced activation in these overactive self-referential brain areas. So it quietens the din of our thinking and our self-talk, etc. So these are some of the mechanisms whereby it works, looking at the brain. Now, this is an interesting review paper. And I'm not even going to pretend to go into all of the detail of this, but what I want to give you is the sense that different forms of meditation activate different areas of the brain. So what affects the meditation on the brain depends on what kind of meditation a person's doing. So, you know, so the focused attention is quite different to open monitoring, you know, so different attention regulation areas. But of course, mantra meditation, language centers of the brain are actually activated in a very different way to, say, body scan or focused attention. So loving kindness meditation involves many of the areas of the brain associated with emotions, as well as stress response and so on. So the point is that different forms of meditation have very different effects on the brain. And there may be more effects that we'll see that are different on the body, but particularly on the brain. And it just makes the point that in terms of which kinds of meditative practices might be most useful, well, it could depend on what the aim of the meditation practice is. So body scan gives a person much more awareness of what's going on in their body, for example. Switching out of the default mode, whatever focus. And so there is quite a lot of overlap, because when a person's mind wanders into default mode, practicing mantra meditation compared to attention on the breath, it's the same default mode they've got, the same circuits of the brain are noticing attention's wandering and reorientating the attention back. So there'll be some overlap, but there certainly are some subtle differences. And these are only the ones that have been studied so far. So in the future, we'll probably find there are more and more differences. But as we would know, different practices might be useful for different things. In the mid-2000s, the research on the brain really started to take off. Sarah Lazar at Harvard, Richie Davidson at Wisconsin. They were two of the leaders. This is just one review of the differences noted in 21 different studies. And there are particular 8 brain regions consistently altered. So areas of the brain associated with meta-awareness, so our ability to be aware of where our attention is and being aware of what's going on around us or what's going on within the body, memory, our ability to regulate our emotions. And the point of emotional regulation is really not so much about trying to control the emotions, which, as you would know personally, but also if you work with patients or clients, you know, trying to control or suppress emotions is enormously stressful and not helpful, rather than through detachment from the emotion, the ability not to be controlled by the emotion. So if we're more aware, there might be an emotion like anger, but the person's able to stand back from the anger and not be controlled by it. And it's not like, well, I've done a bit of meditation, I shouldn't experience anger, but I still do. It's like, no, it's all right. It's all right to be human. You can notice the anger, but is a person able to just notice the anger with less attachment to it and be less controlled by it? And that's a bit of a game changer. And areas of the brain communicate between different areas of the brain. So there's communication pathways seem to get changed as well. But in terms of some of the interesting studies, this was looking at whether meditation is associated with reduced brain aging, which for many of us becomes a more and more interesting and important topic. And this was looking at long-term meditators and controls over subjects, but over 50 years of age. And at age 50, the brains of the meditators are estimated to be about 7.5 years younger than the control group. And every year they aged about a month and 22 days less among the meditators than the non-meditators. So there's certainly, it doesn't just take stress off the body, but also off the brain. This is a review of 29 different studies and looking at the impact of mindfulness in particular. And I keep referring to mindfulness because, as you would know, there's significantly more research on mindfulness than other forms of meditation. My hunch would be that if more studies were done on other forms of meditation as well, such you had 29 studies that you could crunch in a meta-analysis, would probably find very similar effects. And so I'm not going to preferentially say mindfulness better than all the others or any other form of meditation for that matter. I think that there are many different, very valid and in some ways maybe slightly differentially useful in one circumstance or another. But the benefits of all these great traditions of meditation, I think, would be very similar. But these are the areas of executive functioning that have been studied most so far. So what people say is, I'm functioning better, I'm making decisions better, I'm remembering things better as a result. Well, that's because the brain's working better. And this is an interesting and quite recent study, and looking at meditation naive adults, and they underwent an fMRI, so looking at the brain scan before and after 1 month of mindfulness training, and looked at active control, so they did something else that wasn't meditation. And they assessed changes in functional connectivity in the different brain networks. And so the main thing is the default mode network seems to come under some regulation from the salience network. And that's the bit that determines whether or not, you know, thoughts are worth giving attention to or not. It's very important in being able to function in complex situations like communication and so on. So it's like there's this top-down ability for something to come in. It's almost like, I don't know, adult and child, the adult's helping the child to sort of behave itself a little bit better, or perhaps to use another metaphor, training a puppy to stop chewing the slippers and to be able to do something else instead. So there's this top down. I suppose if you'd said, if the areas of the brain through which wisdom expresses itself are coming into play, so that those imagination circuits are not running by themselves and causing all sorts of mischief. So when the person's walking down the street and wanders into worry again, and they've got a background of anxiety, the person's more able to notice, oh, there's worry again. That's okay. I could give it attention if I wanted to. Well, I might just come back to just walking down the street and just hearing the birds and feeling the breeze in my face and so on. So the person's able to just come back. So the awareness starts to transform everything. Awareness often comes in first before the change of attitude. Often people in the early days of learning meditation become much more aware of what's going on in their minds and often in their bodies as well, but become intensely critical and judgmental about it. So that change of attitude towards gentleness and non-reactivity takes a little bit longer. Now, I'm just going to throw a little bit of a cat among the pigeons. In this study from Richie Davidson and their team and published in Science just quite recently, just a couple of months ago, and they didn't replicate some of the findings that had been found previously. And they didn't find that there were these changes in the brain, although what you can see in this graph on the right, the amount of home practice time and whether or not there were these changes. So this blue line was the control group who didn't get the meditation training. What they found was that the group who did, the group who had the mindfulness training, the more hours they did, the less reactive was their amygdala, the stress area of the brain. So if you average it out across the group, some people didn't do much practice, some did quite a lot. If you average it out, you don't get a statistically significant effect. But if you see that the people who practice a lot, they did get significant brain changes. So these are some of the challenges, and it would make a lot of sense. Somebody attends a class on physical exercise, but does no physical exercise between the classes, and at the end of 8 weeks, how are you going? Not much fitter? Oh, well, exercise doesn't work. No, for the people who actually did a lot of exercise between classes, they'll be a lot fitter, but those who just went to the classes and didn't do any training, didn't practice between sessions, they didn't get any significant improvement. So mind-body medicine, who benefits the most? This was looking at healthy participants and no prior experience with meditation. And they had 4 8-week mind-body medicine treatments. So mantra meditation alone, meditation plus yoga, meditation plus ethical education, meditation plus yoga and ethical education. So they looked at various outcomes across those 4 different groups. Now, high anxiety, high absorption, low spirituality, low openness, and younger age associated with a range of positive outcomes. So the people in many ways who kind of needed it the most had perhaps the biggest deficits in some ways, and especially for younger who can more readily adapt, they got the most positive outcomes from the various interventions. In terms of, and these are only findings statistically significant, so if you had a bigger group, you'd probably have more findings that would be statistically significant, but the ones that were statistically significant, receiving ethical education consistently improved well-being. Engaging in physical yoga especially reduced mind wandering, and how grounding is yoga, Tai Chi, things that really, the body, the great thing about the body is that it's always in the present moment. And many of you will have noticed that. Like, it's great to turn up at work in the morning and to actually have your body with you. Like, you don't have to remember to take it with you. You might forget your lunch and leave that at home, but your body's there with you. Anyway, that's a great thing about the body. It's always in the present moment, but the mind is often not. Participants with more maladaptive personality enhanced emotional regulation skills more. So people who really, really needed these skills got the most benefit out of it. So more vulnerable people or those high in absorption seem to benefit more. Now, emotions and pain. So attention to pain is linked to activation of the fight or flight response. Surprise, surprise. Anybody who's ever sat in a dentist chair will probably have recognized this. And the consequent need to escape or avoid it. Now, it's a real, being torn, like wanting to or needing to be in the chair and wanting to escape it at the same time. Now, hypervigilance, this is an abnormal focus on or preoccupation about possible pain or injury. So hypervigilance. So you're there in the dentist chair and you're kind of, and just waiting for some excruciating thing to happen. So getting very stressed even before we experience any physical sensation, other than just lying back on a very comfortable chair. We're already stressed and suffering before anything's even happened. And so there's this close link between emotional reactivity to uncomfortable physical sensations, the thinking about it, the rumination, the worry, the anticipation about it, and attention circuits being preoccupied about it. Now, in looking at research on how mindfulness and quite possibly other forms of meditation can help, but mindfulness in particular in this study, looking at comparing it to placebo. Is mindfulness just a placebo? And what they found was that pain intensity reduced by 27 and 44% for the emotional aspect of pain in the mindfulness group. So pain intensity down 27%, the emotional bit, so even if they're experiencing physical pain, 44% reduced suffering associated with that. The placebo, much, much less of an effect. But they also looked at what happens in the brain. And what the mindfulness seems to do is help the person to reduce their hypervigilance about the pain. So it's like, if you're sitting here right now, and if you're in a very quiet room, and then I draw your attention to a background sound, like the sound of the air conditioning or heating in the background, and then I ask you to try and block that sound out. The harder you try to block it out, the more hypervigilant you become for it. And so it dominates the attention. So what does mindfulness do? It's not about blocking things out, pain or the sound of the heating or anything else, or blocking out the tinnitus in your ears or the television on in the next room. It's just better ability to choose what to be interested in and not interested in. So the people who are more mindful are not trying to block out the pain. It's just like, if it's there, it's there, but the person's more engaged with what they're doing. So the pain, in a sense, recedes into the background, and reduce that emotional reactivity to the pain, learning to be more comfortable with their discomfort, what Shannon Harvey likes to call discomfortable, which I think is a great term for it. Now, conditioning and vicarious fear as well. So this is a study on how social or vicarious fear learning is affected by empathy. Now, our empathy is a great thing. We need more empathy, which, of course, there's nothing particularly wrong with empathy. But what they did in this study was that there was a demonstrator, and they were receiving electrical shocks and paired with a predictive conditioned stimulus, like a sound that came on when the shock was given. And so, but in 3 different situations. So one, the person who was watching this had instructions induced to enhance the empathic response, instructions about reducing the empathic response, or no particular instructions at all. And what they found was the group who had their empathic response enhanced had the strongest fear learning, that is conditioned stress response. So pretty soon that sound would go off and the person would have this conditioned stress response, much more so than if the empathic response was reduced or no instructions at all. And the effect was highest in those with high trait empathy. Now, does this mean empathy's bad or will cause a stress, or don't get stressed, stop empathizing with people? And it's like, and we've been in an environment, in a world lately where there's been a lot of distress, of course. Every day you turn on the news and there's a pandemic and conflict in the world, etc. So this sort of conditioning of the fear or the stress response can be significant. Now, empathy and compassion are 2 very different things, though. And neurologically, they're very different. So brain networks linked to negative emotions and distress are not activated during meditation on compassion, while areas associated with positive emotions are. So when we empathize and get distressed by somebody else's distress, our stress circuits light up. In compassion, those stress circuits do not light up, but circuits of the brain associated with positive emotions do. And so compassion and the brain. So this, in this particular study, people went through fMRI while performing a motion anticipation task, and before and after 3 months training. So those who had compassion training, more so than just take perspective, just think differently. But people actually taught to experience compassion rather than just thinking about a different perspective, what they found was that the affect training or the compassion training led to significant reduction of negative mood when processing things that were associated with human suffering. So the compassion was almost inoculating the person against the stress response. And so empathy is like the first step, but does it move into empathic distress where we focus on ourselves and our negative feelings and emotions and reactions? Or are we empathic and are able to stay present to the person, more positive emotions, to help if we can, pro-social? So if we can move that empathy into compassion rather than empathic distress, we will feel better, but we'll also be a lot more functional as well. And boy, I think this is an important thing in the world at the moment. So mindfulness and compassion, it's implicit in mindfulness training, a person learning to be just gentle with themselves, just bring the attention back, and it's implicit. But compassion cultivation training, so programs, and there are many wisdom traditions, of course, where this is a part of it, cultivating love or compassion for your fellow creatures, fellow human beings. But this compassion cultivation training, does it bring on compassion more than just your basic mindfulness training? And sure enough, it does. So people become significantly more compassionate. So it's a different to the basic mindfulness training. You're giving attention to the cultivation of particular thoughts that you want to cultivate in your life. And the power of attention will, of course, not just change what goes on in your brain, but it changes effects physiologically as well. Interesting particular study on bipartisanship. And this is looking at the amount of animosity. This is an American study, Democrats and Republicans, and things are getting very polarized, not just there, but all around the world. And of course, a lot of this sort of bipartisanship, this sort of fracturing and polarization of views is causing a lot of conflict in the world. And this was a randomized controlled trial, whether a brief befriending meditation so could reduce this affective polarization, this sort of emotional polarization that's often presents itself when you see somebody at the other end of that spectrum and so on. And so what they found was that the befriending meditation reduced this polarization, and by increasing positive feelings relatively more for the political out group rather than for the political in group. So it meant that people could actually still have a level of respect and regard for somebody, even if they weren't in their political in group, and were more able to hear another perspective and to listen and to engage in respectful dialogue. I think this is just the first step into a really important area of research at the moment, and how we can respect different views and perspectives, but still maintain goodwill for others. All right, now I'm just a little bit conscious of time, and although there's some other things I won't have time to get to, I might just stop there, Carolyn, because I don't want to go over time and throw the whole day out of kilter. So I'll be happy to send on the slides for the other things I didn't get to as well. And anyway, thank you. I'll hand it back to you, Carolyn.
Thank you so much, Craig. That's just terrific. I'd be happy to kind of sacrifice some of our 10-minute breaks to hear the rest of it for sure. I find it fascinating. Imagine everybody starting with a bit of, what was it called? Befriending meditation just before each session of Parliament. I mean, wow, if we could do that. I know in Mauritius, they begin with a minute of silence in their parliamentary sessions. So yes. I think we're a little way from that, but who knows? Exponential change is on the way. Yeah. Thanks so much, Craig. Really fascinating.